Many years ago, I actually had a friend, I'll call him Bobby. Bobby's dad actually owned a small construction company. And, it's often the case, Bobby started out working there while he's in high school. He worked on the summers and on weekends and so forth. But eventually started working for his dad full-time. And as is commonly the case, when you start out in that kind of work, what do? You do the menial stuff, right? He dug the holes, he pushed the wheelbarrows, he cleaned the things up, that kind of stuff. But from the very beginning, Bobby kept asking Dad to teach him more about the business. Dad, I want to help with the business. But it was a small company. Basically the company was Dad and Bobby. Pretty much anyone else they needed, they would just kind of hire contractors for the particular job they were working on. And because of that, Dad was always really busy. Dad never really had time to take the time to teach Bobby anything about the business. Now one day, Dad and Bobby are working on a project. They're there early in the morning. Dad gets a call that the project they had finished up the previous week has a problem. So Dad has to run back to that job. Now they know other contractors are coming later in the day. Dad says, hey, I'm not going to be gone very long. Here's what I want you to tell those contractors to do. I'll be back as soon as I can. Well, it turned out that the problems at the other job were more significant than Dad thought. So Dad's gone all day. When Dad finally gets back, the contractors had finished and had all gone. And as Dad looks at what they did, it's all wrong. Because Bobby told them what he was told, but Bobby had never been taught how to do this stuff. So there was some kind of miscommunication. And as a result, all the work that those contractors had done had to be ripped out and done again. And to say the least, Bobby's dad lost it on Bobby and really laid into it about how he had messed so much up. So they go home, drive home silently in the truck that night, come back to work the next day, and Bobby does the smart thing. Bobby keeps his head down. Bobby just kind of does what he's been doing. But after a few weeks go by, Bobby feels like, hopefully we're doing a little better now. So Bobby goes and asks his dad again, would you just teach me more about the business? I'll be able to help more. And Dad reminds him of how much things got messed up the last time I trusted you. And sends him back out to dig the holes and push the wheelbarrow and do that sort of thing. So Bobby just kind of thinks that, well, maybe Dad just needs some more time. So he waits. And periodically he goes to Dad and says, Dad, I just want to learn more about the business so I can help you. And Dad is always too busy or always has some reason that Dad doesn't have time to show him how to do the business. Well, my friend Bobby tried that for close to 2 years after that incident, always with the same answer. So finally, Bobby just realizes that the situation is never going to change. So he gets the courage up to go tell his dad that I'm leaving. I'm taking another job. And Dad was confused. And as it's told to me, Dad said some very terrible things to him. That, what's wrong with Bobby? I've spent years building this business. I've built this for you. Why don't you want this? What's wrong with you? Now, in that situation, was my friend Bobby, was he lazy? Was he ungrateful, unappreciative? He showed up for work every day. He did whatever he was asked to do every day. And he kept trying to be part of the business, but no one would teach him. When that relationship fell apart, was that Bobby's fault? So this week, we're continuing a series that we call Follower. And as I've mentioned, that's kind of an odd name for a series because nobody wants to be a follower, right? We want to be leaders. We want to be independent. But that's what Jesus invites us to be. He invites us to be followers. And as we talked about last week, one of the things that we learn about being a Jesus follower is that what's really important is what we do. Yes, how we feel is important, what we believe is important. But what's most important is what we do. And what we see Jesus do is care for others, to prioritize the needs of others, that when he sees a need he can meet, he meets it. And it turns out that Jesus tells us that something will happen in our lives, that if we're willing to follow him, to do as he does, to listen to his teaching, he tells us that something will happen. He says, I will show you what it's like when someone comes to me, listens to my teaching, and follows it. It's like a person building a house who digs deep, lays the foundation on solid rock. When the floodwaters rise and break against that house, it stands firm because it is well built. And so the key thing to take away from that, right, is that when Jesus asks us to follow, he's not asking us to follow because he's trying to narrow our lives some way. He's not asking us to follow because he wants us to follow a bunch of rules. What he says is, follow my example, right? Follow my teaching. And he's doing that because he wants to expand our life. He wants us to have more in our lives. He wants to have a life that is more full. And one of the things that we learn as we go through our lives is the most full life we can have is a life that reaches beyond our own lives. And that's what Jesus is inviting us to do. And what Jesus tells us here is that if we follow his example, it gives us a firm foundation, right? It gives us something solid to stand on in life, that when we encounter problems, there's something resilient. When we have challenges and the storms of life, there's a firm place to stand to get through those things. And one of the things I want to be really clear about, when Jesus makes this statement, he's not talking about following some specific religion. He's not talking about following a bunch of rules. He's simply saying, watch what I do what you see me do, hear what I teach, and do what I teach. And the thing that I love about this quote is that Jesus uses building as the metaphor. Because I think that all of our lives are at least in part meant to be about building something. That all of us are meant to build something meaningful, something that lasts beyond ourselves, something that reaches beyond ourselves. So with all that in mind, as we continue the series, Follower, I want to ask a question. What's it worth? What are the things that you've built in your lifetime worth? You know, those things that you've been a part of. Maybe you didn't build yourself, but you've been a part of during your life. What are those things worth? I mean, what is the well-being of your family worth? What are the charitable organizations or the nonprofits you've worked with? What is the work you've done there? What is that worth? And then, of course, we have the professional things in our life. What were those things worth? What are all those things worth? Because so often, if we look at how we actually live our lives, there are things that we may say are important, and there are things that we will kind of refer to as being important. But most of us have just a few things that we really pour ourselves into. And if you spent your life pouring yourself into something, some passion you have, what's that worth? Because I think that we would all agree that the things I've mentioned are good things, right? They're good things in our life. That's why we pour ourselves into them. So we believe they're worth a lot. And if these are good things in our life, you know, our families, those things we invest ourselves in, if these are good things, the Apostle Paul invites us to recognize a really important thing about the good things in our life. When we look at the possessions that we have, the positions we get to hold, right, the stuff we have, those things that people entrust to us to lead or be active in, Paul reminds us of something really important. What do you have that God hasn't given you? And if everything you have is from God, why boast about it as though it were not a gift? So Paul is reminding us that the source of all good things in our life are God. And I love the language. It's a gift from God. It's something that God has given you. He wants you to have these good things. It's a gift. But it's also a gift that he's entrusted to us. Because there's something we all want to keep in mind about our lives. All of our lives will end one day. Right? Our time in this world is temporary. So what that means then These gifts that we have, all these possessions that we have, these positions that we rise up to, the responsibilities we hold, the roles we have, if our time in this world is temporary, those things are all temporary. Right? No matter how hard we work, no matter how good a job we do at something, someday someone else is going to do it. There's kind of no getting around that. Right? So what that really means is that we're not really owners of anything. That we are just temporary stewards. We are caretakers for a time. Right? We're the caretaker of our home. Whatever positions we have in organizations or jobs, we are the caretakers of that position. I mean, even our role in our family, we are a caretaker of that role for a time. Well, if we're going to hold those positions and possessions temporarily, but we consider them a gift, and we are caretakers, what does a good caretaker do? A good caretaker makes sure that someone else can take care of it when you can't. So if we look at the good things we have in our lives as gifts and we're caretakers, then we are responsible to assure that someone else is available to take over when the time comes. Now, when that time comes, the time to hand what we have off to someone else, where do we normally find that person? We normally find them in the next generation, those that are younger than us. So if we think about this role of caretakers and this idea of passing on to the next generation, how has that historically worked? And to make the conversation easy, let's look at it specifically from the way organizations work. Right? That in any organization that at least has lasted for many years, has leaders. Right? And those leaders are passed, or the leadership role is passed from one generation to the next. Now, in reality, oftentimes those transitions don't happen smoothly, but they seem to happen good enough to keep the organization going. But if you look closely at what goes on, generally it works sort of like this. That someone holds a leadership position. Oftentimes they will hold it for many, many years. And what does the next generation do during that time? They wait quietly in the wings, waiting for their opportunity to finally come up. And then when that person in leadership finally does leave, and they pass it to the next generation, how much effort normally goes into actually preparing that person to take on that role? I mean, there might be some last-minute cramming towards the end, but the reality is that those who follow are rarely well prepared. Why? Because the person doing the job is so busy doing the job that there's no time to prepare the next generation. So the way those transitions usually work is the one person leaves, the next person finds themselves in the role, unprepared, struggles through, makes tons of mistakes on the job. But most of the time, they eventually get it figured out. And since the place didn't actually shut down, we call that a successful transition. Now, after that experience, what would happen after that? The person who now has the job would be so busy doing the job that he never prepares the next generation. So the cycle just repeats itself over and over. And if you've been around for any length of time, you have been part of an organization that you saw work just like that the next generation wasn't really prepared. And although that worked for a number of years, it seemed to work for a lot of years. But then something, these past few decades, changed. That same model that had somehow worked, even though it wasn't very smooth, that had worked for so many years, seems to have stopped working. That while those who were in charge kept telling the next generation to just wait, you'll get your turn eventually, the next generation said, we're not willing to just sit and wait. We're not going to wait for someday anymore. We're just going to sit here sidelined doing nothing, waiting for something to open up someday. You know, and I said that they said they weren't going to wait, but in general, that's not what really happened. In general, what really happened is they really just didn't say anything. They just stopped coming. And they started pursuing their own interests elsewhere. And so now many organizations that have lasted for many years and are finally, after many, many years, ready to hand over to the next generation, they turn, and the next generation's not there. There's no one there to pass it to. But is it the next generation's fault that that's the case? Was the next generation really just being impatient? Were they being lazy? Were they just in such a big hurry to do everything? That, if they just would have waited a little bit longer, it would have been okay? Is it really their fault? I mean, think about my story of Bobby and his dad. Right? And all these organizations who don't have a next generation to pass to. Many of these organizations, like Bobby and his dad, had asked to be involved, to be kept in the conversation, to have some small part in what was going on. But no one ever had time to teach them. Or sometimes the attitude was even a little bit worse than that. It's like, it's not your turn yet. You wait your turn, then you can do things the way you want to. We expected the next generation to keep waiting, but we never truly invited them in. And I'd like to suggest that this issue about connection between generations is not specifically an organizational issue. I think it applies to kind of every aspect of life. It applies to our families. It applies to just the relationships we have across anything we are involved in. And the thing is that it's such an important, it's such an incredibly important issue. Because, engaging with the next generation is a core issue of life. And the thing we have to recognize is that for many, many years, I think that happened more naturally. Now, you think of that when it was more of a farming society, right? That, the son would work with dad, and they would kind of grow together, right? But then as we are all leading more independent lives, that connection doesn't happen naturally. So that means that connection, if it doesn't happen naturally, we have to choose to find a way to make it happen. Because I think a ton rides on this. Honestly, I think the well-being of the next generation rides on solving this problem. I also think that our connection and community across generations rides on solving this problem. And the question comes down to, what is that worth? What is the well-being of the next generation worth? What is the connection across generations worth? The ability for the young to teach the older and the older to teach the younger. What is that? What is that worth? What is it worth to be meaningfully connected to your kids and your grandkids? To be meaningfully connected to people who've come up in a very different time from you and see the world differently than you do, and have the chance to talk about that and to really know what each other are going through in life. So what is the life, wellness, and future of the next generation worth? It's certainly worth saving their lives, but it's also worth investing in their lives. Honestly, what is it not worth? Isn't it worth everything to care for the next generation? Now, I think an obvious question rises up is that Jim, you started out saying that this was a message about following Jesus. Does following Jesus address any of these issues? Turns out, yes, it does. It turns out that if we look at the life of Jesus, he prioritized the next generation. He actually intentionally spent time investing in the next generation. But it turns out that that's an issue that's pretty easy to miss. But if we look at what we call the Gospels, those documents of Jesus' life, we see that right from early in his ministry, he begins to invest in the next generation. In fact, Luke tells us, at daybreak, Jesus called together all his disciples and chose 12 of them to be apostles. So early in Jesus' ministry, he had already built up a group of followers. He looked at that group of followers and said that these 12 are the ones who are ready to lead. And they're the names that we know. Right? Simon, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, another James, another Simon, Judas, and Judas Iscariot. So what we see there is that Jesus did not wait to start giving the next generation responsibility. He did, as soon as he saw those who were ready, he started giving them a little responsibility. But now, this does lead to a question. It's great that Jesus engaged the next generation as leaders, but how do you pick leaders in your next generation if you turn around and there's no next generation? Well, Jesus answers that question as well. We do what Jesus did. Do you know what Jesus did? Do you know how he found his next generation? He went to where they are. Jesus didn't just sit back and wait for the next generation to show up. I mean, if we think about Andrew and John, John being the youngest apostle, we often think only like 13 or 14 years old. Andrew and John were hanging out with John the Baptist every time. So Jesus went down and met them there, and they started to follow him. Peter. Jesus had multiple encounters with Peter. We know that Jesus at least once went over Peter's house. And then eventually one day, as Peter was finishing up work, Jesus went down to where he works and got in his boat. And they had an experience that changed Peter's life. Matthew, the hated tax collector. Jesus went down to the tax collector booth and invited him. But he didn't just invite him. He also went and had dinner with him at his house and hung out with his friends for a while. Jesus didn't wait for the next generation to come to him. He went and he got them. And sometimes what that meant is he went to the places where respectable people don't go. Because when Jesus went to Matthew's house and hung out with Matthew's friends, the respectable people complained about him. Why is he hanging out with those people? But then those people started to follow him and trust him. And he invested in them. And as he invested in them, you know what they did? They started to invite others who he then invested in. And what's kind of interesting is that when Jesus selected his leaders from that next generation and he had invested in them, he then empowered them. Again, first he started small, but then he actually empowered them to go out on their own. He didn't make them wait until he wasn't around. He let them go out and make their own mistakes on their own while he was still around. And he empowered them, right? Because Matthew tells us Jesus sent out the 12 apostles, and as he was sending them out, Jesus said, "Look, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves. So be shrewd as snakes and harmless as doves." What he's telling them, you're going to face challenges, and you're not really ready for them. But you'll be okay. Head out there, be smart about it. You're going to experience difficulties. And he knew they would experience difficulties. But if he knew they weren't fully ready, why send them out in the first place? Because he knew they would have to grow into the role. And the only way to really grow into the role is to take on the responsibilities of the role. So he let them make mistakes while he was still there to support them. So when they made mistakes, he could talk through what happened with them and help them learn from it so they wouldn't do it again. But he did all that while he was still there. And to show how important Jesus saw this process of engaging leaders and empowering them, he didn't do this just one time with the 12 apostles. We focus so much on that 12. But it turns out that as his followers grew, and there were more and more of his followers, he repeated this process. Because Luke tells us the Lord then chose 72 other disciples, sent them ahead in pairs to all the towns and places he planned to visit. So an even larger group he invested in and prepared in a very similar way to what he had done with the original 12. But why is Jesus doing all this? I mean, doesn't this take a bunch of his time? I mean, isn't all the time he spends with them time he's not doing the work that he's supposed to do? Because it had to take a ton of time. Well, I think he did that for a really important reason. He did that for a reason that I will admit that I often forget. Jesus knew that his time on this earth was limited. One day, he wasn't going to be here anymore. And so what he had built was going to be turned over. And he wanted to make sure that they were ready, that the apostles and the disciples were ready to carry on the work. So he empowered them early. He trusted them early so he could teach them not just what to do, but also how to lead. Because if no leaders were raised up, no one would be able to take over what he was doing. And the thing that I think is easy to miss in this is that Jesus doing all this wasn't just about the work. I mean, the work, of course, is incredibly important. But it was also about the relationships. I mean, imagine what the relationship with Jesus would be like with those leaders as he taught them things, as they went out, as they dealt with challenges, as they worked through those problems after the fact together. How close and strong would their relationship have become? And then imagine the relationships of the apostles and the other disciples as they went out and they had struggles and they talked out their problems together. I ran into this issue. Hey, I saw an issue just like that. This is what I did. How close and strong would those relationships become? Because they all had an active part, an important part, in something important. From early on, they had important roles, an important mission. And that shared effort made strong, meaningful bonds within the generations and across generations. In fact, we know that Peter was much older than John. And so men from two different generations could work together on similar problems. Now, I truly believe that this is an issue and a process that can work in kind of every aspect of our lives. Again, our families, charitable organizations, nonprofit organizations, our professional stuff, all these things really matter. And we saw Jesus living it out, and we know how strong of leaders those followers became. But I think there's also a very particular place that this model was meant to be used. Because what was Jesus building at the time? He was building the church, what we call the church. And I am certain that he did things this way with the intention that his church would always work this way. And then we see that illustrated kind of in a really neat way in a conversation that Jesus has with a group of his disciples. Because over time, Jesus is getting more and more well-known. And as he's getting more and more well-known, people are speculating about who he is. Right? Some people are saying he's the Messiah. Some people are saying he's someone else. Some people are saying he's a charlatan of some sort. So Jesus sits down with his followers, and he asks them, who do you think I am? Right, so Matthew tells us that Jesus said to his disciples, who do you yourselves say that I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then as Jesus replies, and I also say to you that you are Peter. Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Now, if you've been in church for any length of time, you have heard that verse. And you probably know that the name Peter actually means rock. So oftentimes that verse is interpreted to say that Jesus was telling Peter that I will build my church on you. That's often what we're told it means. But there's something to keep in mind. The documents that have been put together that we call the Bible, were they originally written in English? Nope, they were not written in English. This particular document was written in Greek. And if we look at what the Greek tells us, that is not at all what it says. So if we focus in just on the text I have here in yellow, right? So it starts out with, you are the Christ. Well, if we look at Peter, the actual word there that we interpret as the word Peter is actually the word Petros. Okay, Petros does mean stone or rock. But where it says upon this rock I will build my church, that word rock is Petra, a different word. Why is that important? Because Petra means large rock formation or bedrock. So what Jesus is saying is that, first of all, and this is really important to remember, Jesus says, I will build my church. In other words, Jesus is saying, I will take responsibility for building my church, not just now, but for all of eternity. I will build my church. But I'm going to build it on a bedrock foundation. What is that bedrock foundation? That Jesus is the Christ. That he will build his church on the fact that he is the Christ, the Son of God. But then Peter is a rock or a stone. Well, in the first century, if you wanted to build something that was strong and durable, what would you build it from? Rocks or stones? So what Jesus is saying is that I will build my church on the foundation of who I am. But you, Peter, you are an important building block in building that church. You are one of the strong stones that's going into that wall that I'm building. But you know who else is? You are. I am. Right? Every Jesus follower across all of time is a stone in the wall of the church that Jesus is building. Right? In the sense that we are all called to be part of building the church, to follow the example of Jesus, to live the example of Jesus. So we all have a critically important part. We all have an important role. But the thing we have to remember, that our role is temporary. One day we won't be here. And in the scope of time, we're not here very long. So we have to recognize that we are stewards, that we are responsible in the things that we are responsible for, to prepare the next generation, to invest in them, to empower them, to do what it takes to reach them, but also to listen and be there. And the thing is that something happens when we do that we get a chance to invest in people younger than us, and we get to watch their lives grow, but our lives grow as well. It is truly how I believe Jesus always planned his church to go. So I think that by embracing that, that is our chance to make a difference in our own lives, a difference in the lives that we reach, recognizing that it is not an easy task. It is not an easy task. Now, for what it's worth, in the first century, wasn't an easy task either. But they did it. The growth of the church in the first 300 years was remarkable while under a hostile environment. It's possible. It is possible to do that same thing again. But it has to be something that we do with intention.